I was standing in my sister's kitchen holding a wedding program with my own name misspelled on it, Yasmin, with an E, like they hadn't quite committed to remembering how I spelled my own name, when my mother said the sentence that started unraveling everything. "We had to sell the Briarwood apartment to cover the difference," she said, not quite looking at me, arranging a tray of chin-chin like the sentence weighed nothing at all. "The venue deposit alone was $11,000. You understand, don't you? Family helps family. My name is Yasmin, I was 33 years old, a nurse practitioner at a cardiology clinic in the medical center, and the apartment my mother had just casually informed me was gone, sold, done, spoken of in past tense, was not hers to sell. It was mine. My grandmother's apartment in the Briarwood complex off Fondren, left to me specifically, by name, in a will my grandmother had drawn up 8 years before she died, precisely because she'd watched, over decades, exactly how my mother handled anything she got her hands on. I stood there with the misspelled program in my hand and felt the floor tilt very slightly, the particular vertigo of hearing something stated as fact that cannot possibly be fact. "What do you mean, sold?" I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "The Briarwood place," my mother said again, like repetition would make the sentence make more sense. "We sold it in February." "You knew things were tight with the wedding, Yasmin, don't act surprised. Your sister only gets married once. I want to tell you what came before that kitchen, because you need to understand the ground I was standing on when it opened beneath me. I'd grown up the younger of 2 daughters in a house where my sister Chioma, 2 years older, effortlessly the family's golden child since the day she was born, had never once had to fight for anything the way I did. Chioma was the one photographed at every family event, the one whose accomplishments got announced at church, the one my mother introduced first at every gathering, every single time, in an order that never once varied across 33 years. I'd learned, young, that my role in the family was to be reliable, uncomplaining, quietly competent, the daughter who didn't need managing, because the daughter who needed managing always got managed first. My grandmother, my father's mother, NNE, we called her, had seen all of it clearly, in the particular unsentimental way grandmothers sometimes do. She'd bought the Briarwood apartment outright in 1998, rented it out for years, and when she died, 6 years ago, her will had left it to me by name, with a note attached that I still have, folded in my jewelry box, for Yasmin, who will not waste it, and who has waited long enough for something to be fully hers. I hadn't lived in it. I'd kept it rented, the income supplementing my savings quietly for 6 years, a piece of stability I'd never once had to explain or justify to anyone, because it was mine, the one thing in my life my mother's opinions had no legal claim over. Until, apparently, February. "You sold it," I said again, because my mind hadn't caught up to the sentence yet, kept circling back to it the way you touch a bruise to confirm it's really there. "Mom, that apartment wasn't in your name. It was mine. NNE left it to me." My mother's face did something complicated, not quite guilt, not quite defiance, something practiced and smooth that I'd seen on her face my whole life whenever a conversation moved toward territory she'd already decided not to enter honestly. "Your father handled the paperwork," she said. "There was a power of attorney, from years ago, when you were traveling for that conference in Atlanta and needed someone to sign for the property tax renewal. We used that. It was all legal, Yasmin, don't make this into something it isn't. Chioma needed help, and you have a good job, a stable job, and that apartment was just sitting there collecting rent nobody was using for anything important." I stood in that kitchen holding a program with my name spelled wrong, and I felt something in me go very quiet and very still, the particular stillness that arrives right before you understand your life has just changed shape in a way you cannot undo. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever heard your own family describe stealing from you as help, you understand exactly the specific, hollow silence that settles into a kitchen after a sentence like that. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the program, though some old animal part of me wanted to. I said, very carefully, that I needed to leave, and I left my sister's kitchen 4 days before her wedding with a program that spelled my name wrong and a sentence in my ears that I would spend the next several months taking apart, piece by piece, until I understood exactly what had actually happened to me. I need to tell you about the power of attorney my mother mentioned, because it matters enormously for what comes later. 3 years earlier, I'd flown to a nursing conference in Atlanta for 4 days, and my property taxes on the Briarwood apartment had come due while I was traveling. My mother had offered, casually, at a family dinner, to handle it for me if I signed a limited power of attorney, narrow, specific, for that one transaction, at her insistence that it would be easier than trying to do it from a hotel room. I'd signed it without much thought, the way you sign things for a parent you still, at 30, hadn't fully learned to distrust. I'd assumed, reasonably, that the document had expired with the transaction it was created for, the way limited powers of attorney are supposed to. I did not know, standing in Chioma's kitchen that afternoon, that the document had never actually specified an expiration date the way it should have, a detail I wouldn't fully understand the weight of until much later, when I finally sat down with a lawyer and a magnifying glass and my own 3-year-old signature. Something tightened in my chest even hours after I left that kitchen, replaying the conversation. I told myself it was just the shock of the news. It wasn't only that. I drove home that evening, not to my mother's house, not anywhere close to family, but straight to my own apartment, the one I actually lived in, a rental across town that had nothing to do with any of this, and I sat on my couch for a long time without turning on the lights. I called my best friend, Denise, no relation to characters in other stories, a different Denise, someone I'd known since nursing school, sharp and steady in exactly the way I needed that night. I told her everything, the misspelled program, the sentence about the apartment, the old power of attorney I barely remembered signing. "They can't just do that," Denise said. "Yasmin, that's not how any of this works. You need a lawyer before you need anything else, including a conversation with your mother." I knew she was right. I also knew, sitting in the dark of my own living room, that some part of me still wanted there to be an explanation, some version of events where this was a misunderstanding, a paperwork error, anything other than what it was starting, slowly and sickly, to look like. I didn't ask my mother the follow-up questions I already half suspected I didn't want the answers to. Not that night. I told myself I needed time to think. What I actually needed was time to keep not fully believing it. There was a mini cliffhanger sitting quietly under that phone call with Denise, one I couldn't see the full shape of yet. She mentioned, almost in passing, that her cousin Renee worked in real estate and might be able to pull the sale records for me if I wanted to know exactly how it had happened. I said yes. I didn't know yet that Renee's name would turn out to already be attached to this story in a way none of us expected. Chioma's wedding happened 4 days later, exactly as scheduled, at a venue in the Heights with white orchids and a live band and 200 guests who had no idea that the venue itself had been partially funded by property that wasn't legally anyone's to sell. I went. I want to explain why, because it matters. I went because not going would have made me the story, would have turned a family gathering into a referendum on my grievance before I even had proof solid enough to stand on. I smiled in photographs. I gave a toast I'd written weeks earlier, before I knew, full of warm, generic sentiments about sisterhood that felt, delivering them, like reciting lines in a play I no longer had a part in. I smiled through that entire reception, even though inside I wanted to ask 100 questions. It was easier, that night, to hold the mask steady than to let 200 guests watch it crack. Chioma herself never once brought up the apartment that night, not directly. She was radiant, exhausted, entirely absorbed in the particular self-contained bubble that brides live inside for their own wedding day, and some part of me, watching her, genuinely believed she might not know the full extent of where the money had come from. That belief would turn out to be only partly true, and I'd spend months untangling exactly how much of it she'd known and chosen not to ask about. My father, Emeka, moved through that reception the way he moved through most family gatherings, present, warm, entirely deferential to my mother in every decision large enough to matter. I watched him that night with new eyes, noticing for the first time how carefully he avoided being alone with me, how he found reasons to be refilling drinks or checking on vendors whenever I drifted near him. I noticed it. I filed it away, the way I'd filed away 100 small things about my father's careful distance over the years, and I told myself, one more time, that it was nothing. The weeks after the wedding settled into a strange, muffled normalcy. I went to work. I saw patients, adjusted medications, charted notes with a steadiness that surprised me, given how unsteady everything else in my life had become. I kept a private folder on my laptop, labeled with the blandest name I could think of, C Credits 2024, where I began saving everything: the old power of attorney document I finally located in my own email archive, a screenshot of the wedding program with my misspelled name, notes from my conversation with my mother, dated and timed. Denise's cousin Renee got back to me 9 days after the wedding, and what she found cracked the whole thing open in a direction I hadn't expected. The sale went through a small brokerage, Renee said, on a call I recorded with her permission, my hands unsteady in a way I hadn't expected as I hit record. And Yasmin, the agent listed on the transaction, is someone named Priscilla Adeyemi. Does that name mean anything to you? It did. Priscilla was my mother's oldest friend, someone I'd called Auntie Priska my whole life, someone who'd attended every birthday, every graduation, every family Christmas since before I could remember. Priscilla ran a small real estate brokerage out of a strip mall off Bissonnette, and I understood, with a sinking clarity, exactly why my mother had chosen her for this particular transaction instead of any of the larger, more reputable firms in the city. Something in me went very still on that call, not shock exactly. Something closer to recognition, the way you recognize a shape you've been half seeing in the dark for weeks without letting yourself name it. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever discovered that the family friend who's been at every major moment of your life was quietly complicit in the worst thing your family ever did to you, you understand exactly the specific, disorienting grief of that discovery. It's not just betrayal. It's the retroactive poisoning of every memory you have of that person, every birthday card, every hug, all of it recolored by what you now know they were capable of. I didn't confront Priscilla directly. Not yet. I called Denise instead, and together we started building something more careful, a timeline, a folder of documents, a plan that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with making sure that when I finally spoke, I would be standing on ground nobody could argue me off of. I understood, sitting at my kitchen table that week with the folder open in front of me, something that reached past just my family, that the people who hurt us most completely are almost never strangers. They're the people who already knew exactly where our trust lived, because they helped build the room it was kept in. The old power of attorney document, when I finally read it properly, with a lawyer's help, was more damning than I'd expected. It had been drafted narrowly, for the single purpose of property tax renewal, exactly as I remembered, but a clause near the bottom, one I'd skimmed past at 30 without a second thought, granted broader authority for matters related to the management of the property described herein without a specified end date. It was sloppy legal language, the kind a careful attorney would never have let stand, and I understood, looking at it now, that my mother had likely known exactly how much room that sloppy clause left, possibly from the very day I signed it. I found something else, going through old emails from 3 years earlier, that stopped me cold. An email from my mother to Priscilla, dated just 2 weeks after I'd signed the power of attorney in Atlanta, subject line simply question, asking whether a power of attorney without a clear end date could technically be used later for something bigger, if the situation called for it. I sat with that email for a long time before I understood what I was actually looking at. Not an opportunity my mother had stumbled into 3 years later when Chioma's wedding costs spiraled, but a possibility she had identified, deliberately, almost immediately after I signed the document, 3 full years before she'd ever have a reason to use it. That email should have told me everything I needed to know, 3 years before Chioma's wedding. It didn't, because I wasn't ready yet to understand that my mother's help had never actually been separate from her plans for how to use me. If you've ever found proof that something you'd trusted for years had actually been calculated from the very beginning, you understand there's a particular kind of vertigo in realizing the betrayal wasn't a single decision, but a door that had been quietly left ajar for years, waiting. I met with an attorney, a woman named Farah Kassab who specialized in property and estate disputes, and laid out everything I had. She was careful, methodical, asked questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. The good news, she said, reviewing the power of attorney, is that this document is weak enough that a judge is very likely to find it was misused beyond its original scope, especially with the email you found showing intent to use it more broadly. The harder part is going to be proving the sale itself was fraudulent rather than just poorly authorized. That's where the actual paperwork from the transaction matters. That's where Renee's help became essential. Over the following weeks, working carefully and quietly, we pulled the full sale file, the deed transfer, the buyer's information, and, most importantly, the notarized signature page, which was supposed to carry my signature authorizing the sale. It didn't. It carried a signature that was close to mine, close enough to pass a casual glance, but wrong in the small, specific ways. Forgery is always wrong once you know to look. The loop on my Y sat differently than it ever had in 16 years of my actual signature, the pressure inconsistent in a way that suggested someone practicing rather than someone signing naturally. I sat with that signature page for a long time, comparing it against 6 years of my own bank statements, my own tax returns, every document I could find with my real signature on it. Something in me broke open in a new place that afternoon, not shock this time, but a colder, more specific grief, the realization that someone had sat somewhere, practicing my name, until it looked close enough to fool a notary. I know some of you already sense where this is heading. I didn't want to, not fully. Some part of me still needed to believe there was a version of this where my mother hadn't gone quite that far. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my adult life, carrying a legal case I couldn't yet reveal alongside a family that had no idea I was building one. I attended a family dinner 3 weeks after the wedding, sitting across from my mother, my father, and Chioma, making small talk about Chioma's honeymoon photos, while a forged signature sat photographed on my own phone in my pocket. I didn't ask the real question that dinner, not because I didn't want the answer, but because some part of me was still bargaining for a version of my mother that hadn't quite finished dying yet. Sleep became difficult that stretch. I'd lie awake doing math I didn't want to do, the value of the apartment, 6 years of rental income I'd never fully appreciated the security of until it was gone, the cost of the attorney's hours mounting against a case I still wasn't certain I had the stomach to fully pursue. My hands developed a tremor I noticed most sharply whenever my mother's name lit up my phone screen, an old reflex turning, without my consent, into something closer to bracing for impact. I lost weight that month without meaning to. Meals sat untouched some evenings, my appetite stolen by a low, constant hum of stress I couldn't fully name even to myself. She told me, much later, what was going through her mind during that stretch, though it took months after everything for her to say any of it plainly. I told myself, the whole time, that Yasmin would understand eventually. That she had a good salary, a stable career, no children yet to provide for, and that Chioma's wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime obligation that our whole community would be watching. I told myself the apartment was practically an accident of inheritance anyway, that NNE had been sentimental, favoring Yasmin because she'd always been the quieter one, and that a mother's job was to correct imbalances her own mother-in-law had created without meaning to. I convinced myself, some weeks, that I was actually doing Yasmin a favor, teaching her that family comes before property, a lesson I told myself she'd thank me for eventually, once the sting wore off. I didn't let myself think too hard about the signature. Priscilla handled that part. I told myself that made it not really my hands doing it. I didn't know yet how close Yasmin already was to having everything she needed to prove otherwise. I met with Farah Kassab twice more that month, building the case methodically, the power of attorney's misuse, the forged signature, the email showing premeditation, and, crucially, a forensic handwriting comparison Farah commissioned that confirmed, with professional certainty, that the signature on the sale documents did not match 16 years of my authenticated signature on file with the state. I came close to confronting my mother directly, twice, during that stretch, once on the phone, the words half-formed, before I stopped myself and hung up under the pretext of a work emergency. I told myself I was waiting for the case to be airtight before I said anything. That was true. It was also, if I'm honest, fear, the same old fear of what confronting her fully would cost the last threads of a relationship I still, despite everything, wasn't ready to fully sever. Looking back, that wasn't just strategy. It was the same old habit, dressed in new clothes, the part of me that had spent 33 years needing the room to stay calm more than needing the truth spoken inside it. If you've ever had every piece of proof you needed and still found yourself waiting for one more sign before you could make yourself act, You understand that particular kind of exhaustion, where readiness and courage turn out to be two entirely different things. Farah filed the initial legal notice quietly, 6 weeks after the wedding, a formal demand letter to the buyer, to Priscilla's brokerage, and to my mother, outlining the fraudulent basis of the sale and demanding either the return of the property or full restitution of its value, with the forged signature evidence and the incriminating email attached as exhibits. I asked Farah to hold off on serving my mother directly until I'd had one conversation with her myself, in person, on my own terms. Farah advised against it. You don't owe her a warning, she said, but I needed it anyway, for reasons that had less to do with strategy and more to do with needing to look my mother in the eye one more time before the lawyers took over entirely. I arranged to meet her at my parents' house, on a Saturday afternoon, and I asked Chioma and my father to be present, which surprised my mother enough that she agreed without much resistance, assuming, I think, that this was going to be some kind of reconciliation visit. She had, I noticed the moment I walked in, put out a tray of chin-chin, the same gesture from the kitchen 4 months earlier, arranged now with the easy confidence of a woman who believed the worst of this was already behind her. I sat down across from her, my father beside her, Chioma near the window, and I set the folder on the coffee table between us, the power of attorney with its narrow original scope highlighted, the email from 3 years earlier, the forensic handwriting report, and, on top, an enlarged printout comparing my real signature against the one on the sale document, side by side. I know you didn't have my permission to sell that apartment, I said, my voice steady, quieter than I expected it to come out. I know the power of attorney was for one specific transaction 3 years ago, and I know you asked Auntie Priska, in writing, whether it could be stretched for something bigger, less than 2 weeks after I signed it. And I know the signature on the sale documents isn't mine. A forensic examiner confirmed it. I've already filed a demand letter with an attorney. The room went very still. My father's face had gone pale in a way I'd never seen on him. Chioma's eyes moved between me and our mother, something complicated moving across her face that I couldn't yet fully read. My mother recovered faster than I expected, her composure sliding back into place like a mask she'd practiced putting on quickly. You're going to do this in front of your father, in front of your sister, like some kind of ambush, she said, her voice climbing, sharp and immediate. After everything I have sacrificed for this family, you want to sit there with your lawyer papers and act like I'm some kind of criminal, when everything I have ever done was to hold this family together? She stood up, turning toward the kitchen doorway, raising her voice in a way that carried, deliberately, toward the hallway where I now realized several members of the extended family, my Aunt Ngozi, visiting for the weekend, and 2 cousins, had been within earshot the entire time. Come hear this, she called out. Come hear what your cousin is trying to do to this family over an apartment, days after her sister's wedding. Aunt Ngozi appeared in the doorway first, followed by the cousins, and I felt the room shift beneath me, my careful, private confrontation suddenly widening into something closer to a trial, with an audience already primed, by my mother's framing, to see me as the aggressor. For one terrible half-minute, I felt the old current pull at me, the family's collective attention turning, expectant, toward how I'd defend myself against a version of events my mother had just constructed in real time. I didn't let it hold. I'm not trying to do anything to this family, I said, my voice not rising to match hers, staying level even as the room filled with more faces. I'm telling the truth about what happened to property that was legally mine, sold without my permission, using a forged signature. Everyone in this room is welcome to look at the documents themselves. I picked up the enlarged signature comparison and held it out, first toward my aunt, who took it with visibly shaking hands. Aunt Ngozi looked at the 2 signatures for a long moment, and something in her face changed, not surprise, I realized, watching her, but something closer to confirmation of a suspicion she'd apparently already been quietly carrying. I told you this would come out eventually, she said quietly, not to me, but to my mother. I told you, back in January, when you first mentioned it to me, that this wasn't going to end well. I should have said something to Yasmin then. I didn't, because I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere between a mother and her daughters. I was wrong. My mother's face went rigid. Ngozi. No, Ngozi said, and her voice, though quiet, carried a finality that silenced the room more effectively than any raised voice could have. I've watched you favor Chioma over Yasmin their entire lives, and I told myself that was just how some mothers are, that it wasn't my business. But forging a signature is not favoritism, Adiz. That's a crime. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner, Yasmin. I should have. Chioma had been silent through most of it, standing near the window, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. I didn't know about the signature, she said. I swear to you, Yasmin, I didn't know. Mom told me the apartment was being sold because you'd agreed to help, that you two had worked it out together. I believed her. I didn't ask more questions than that, because I wanted the wedding to happen without complications, and I think, if I'm honest, some part of me didn't want to know if the answer was going to be complicated. I heard something in her voice that surprised me, not the easy deflection I might have expected from the sister who'd spent her whole life being protected from hard truths, but something closer to real shame, arriving late but arriving honestly. My mother, cornered now by her sister's confirmation and her older daughter's admission, tried once more to redirect the room's attention, her voice sharp and fast. You have no idea what it's like, she said, turning back to me, to raise 2 daughters in this country, working 2 jobs while your father was building his contracting business, watching other families in our community throw weddings that cost more than some people's houses, and feeling the shame of not being able to give Chioma the same. I did what I had to do. And you, she turned toward me fully now, something desperate entering her voice, you have always had more than you appreciated. A good job, no children to provide for, an apartment sitting empty collecting rent you didn't even need. Was it really going to hurt you that much? I felt something rise in me then, not the calm, controlled voice I'd walked in with, but something rawer, finally surfacing after months of careful restraint. It's not about whether I needed the money, I said, my voice climbing for the first time that afternoon. It's about the fact that you forged my signature. You had someone practice my handwriting until it looked close enough to fool a notary. That's not a mother making a hard choice for her family, Mom. That's fraud. And you did it to me specifically, because you knew, you've always known, that I was the daughter who wouldn't make a scene, who'd absorb it quietly the way I've absorbed everything else my whole life. You were counting on that. And you were wrong. The room had gone completely silent. My father, who had said nothing this entire time, finally spoke, his voice hoarse in a way I'd never heard from him. Adiz, he said quietly. Is this true? The signature? My mother didn't answer him directly. She looked, instead, at the document still sitting on the coffee table, and something in her face finally, visibly, cracked. I need to sit down, she said, and sank back into her chair, her hands beginning to tremble in a way that mirrored, uncomfortably, my own hands over the past several months. The legal process moved forward regardless of that afternoon's collapse. Farah filed formally within the week, against the sale itself, against Priscilla's brokerage for facilitating a transaction with a forged signature, and, separately, a demand that my mother personally cover the difference between the property's value and what remained recoverable, since the buyer, an investment company that had already begun renovations, was entitled to certain protections as a good faith purchaser under Texas law. The case settled 8 months later, out of court, after Priscilla's brokerage, facing the threat of losing its license entirely, agreed to a substantial settlement covering most of the apartment's value, with my mother personally responsible for the remainder, a debt that would take her years to fully repay, structured through a payment plan Farah negotiated with a precision I was deeply grateful for. Priscilla lost her real estate license within the year, the state board moving swiftly once the forensic handwriting evidence was formally entered into the record. I heard, through the loose network of family friends who still spoke to me, that she'd left Houston entirely, moved to be near a daughter in Dallas, the decades of friendship with my mother apparently unable to survive the specific weight of what she'd helped do. My father moved out of the house 4 months after that Saturday afternoon, not dramatically, not with any public announcement, just a quiet, gradual separation that became, eventually, a formal one. He told me, months later, over a lunch that felt like the beginning of an entirely new relationship between us, that he'd known more than he'd let himself fully admit at the time, that he'd signed off on paperwork he should have questioned harder, and that watching me stand in that living room with the documents had been the moment he could no longer avoid what he'd been avoiding for years. I understood something, sitting across from my father at that lunch, that reached past just this one betrayal. That silence, even well-meaning silence, is still a kind of participation. He hadn't forged anything. But he'd known enough to ask questions he never asked, and that, too, had cost me something. Chioma and I are rebuilding something slower and more honest than what we had before, not the easy, unequal sisterhood of our childhood, but something closer to actual partnership, built on the fact that she finally, fully, believes me about everything, and has said so, more than once, without qualification. My mother and I speak rarely now, and carefully, when we do. She has never fully apologized in the specific, complete way I once hoped she might. The closest she's come was a phone call, months after the settlement, where she told me, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from her, that she understood now that she'd spent so many years afraid of not matching to us that she'd built her whole identity around being needed, and had never learned how to want something from me that didn't also serve her own fear of becoming irrelevant. I didn't forgive her fully on that call. I'm not sure I ever will completely, and I've made peace with the fact that I don't have to. I bought a new apartment 18 months after that Saturday afternoon, smaller than Briarwood, closer to the hospital, entirely mine, with a deed I now check obsessively, a habit I doubt I'll ever fully lose. I hung N&E's note on my wall, the one that came with the will, for Yasmin, who will not waste it, and who has waited long enough for something to be fully hers. I think about that note every time I unlock my own front door. What makes this story difficult to sit with isn't simply that Adie's committed fraud against her own daughter, it's how completely ordinary the justification felt from the inside. She wasn't a cartoon villain rubbing her hands together over stolen property. She was a woman who had spent decades measuring her worth by her ability to provide, terrified of a community's judgment, and who found, in her younger daughter's quiet reliability, the path of least resistance for solving a problem she was too proud to solve honestly. Yasmin's role as the daughter who wouldn't make a scene wasn't an accident of personality, it was a role the family had assigned her early and reinforced for 33 years, and her mother's calculation, evident in that 3-year-old email asking whether the power of attorney could be stretched, reveals something colder than opportunism, premeditation dressed as a last-minute crisis decision. The turning point wasn't the discovery of the sale itself, but the forensic confirmation of the forged signature, the moment the story shifted from a family dispute about fairness into an unambiguous legal fact nobody in that room could argue around. That shift matters because it illustrates something true beyond this specific family. Ambiguous grievances get relitigated forever, but a forged signature doesn't allow for competing narratives. Sometimes the difference between being believed and being dismissed isn't the size of the wrong done to you, it's whether you have something undeniable to place on the table. Ngozie's late confession and Chioma's admission both point toward the same quiet lesson: complicity doesn't require malice, only convenience. Neither woman set out to harm Yasmin. Both chose, at different points, not to ask a question whose answer would have been inconvenient, and both had to reckon, eventually, with what that choice actually cost someone they loved. What lingers longest is Emeka's late admission, not that he participated actively, but that he never once let himself ask the hard question until the documents made the question unavoidable. Passive complicity, this story suggests, is still complicity. The absence of active harm doesn't equal innocence when silence is what allowed the harm to continue. That's the thread reaching past this one apartment, this one wedding. Families often assign roles early: the reliable one, the favored one, the one who provides, and those roles quietly determine who gets protected and who gets used, long before any single crisis reveals the pattern in full. Which leaves something worth sitting with, whoever's listening. I think about that wedding program most of all, my own name spelled wrong, for days before I found out what had actually paid for the ink it was printed with. Small things carry more truth than we want them to sometimes. A misspelled name isn't proof of anything on its own. But it was the first thread, and I almost let it go. Here's what I'd want you to take from this: if anything, being the reliable one in your family isn't a compliment if it means you're the one nobody thinks to ask before they take something from you. And if you ever find yourself gathering proof quietly, taking your time, waiting until you're standing on ground nobody can argue you off of. That's not coldness. That's just what it looks like to finally take your own reality as seriously as everyone else has been asked to take theirs. If this story stirred something in you, a role your family assigned you early that you're still quietly performing, a piece of proof you've been sitting on, waiting for the right moment, tell me one word in the comments. Just the word. Thank you for staying with me through this one. It took me a long time to be able to tell it without my hands shaking. I hope it found you exactly when you needed it to.